Hello everyone, I'm Leah Toms from the marketing team and I'd like to welcome you to our Q1 Pulse webinar. I have Nick France, CTO of SSL, and Tim Callan, Chief Compliance Officer here for you today. They are here to update you about the latest industry trends and developments, what came out of the last CAP forum meeting and many more. As always, we're recording this presentation and we'll share it with you after the webinar. If you've got any questions during the presentations, we'd love to hear them. Please use the chat function and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. With that, I hand you over to Nick and Tim.
All right, thank you, Leah. Hi, Nick.
Hey, Tim, how are you? Thanks, Leah, as well.
I'm doing great. So we have 4 items on the agenda today. One is we just want to give an update on the ongoing saga of shortening certificate lifespans. This is a big trend throughout the industry. It's been going on for years. There's more progress now and more coming. And, you know, at a real high level, certificates are getting shorter everywhere. And we're going to get into the details of what that looks like. We want to discuss CAA for MIME, which is an extension of the CAA protocol, and we'll explain what that is. An update on post-quantum cryptography, which also is, you know, something that progresses forward and isn't going to stop. And then lastly, we have a very recent news update on MPIC or MPIC, which is the official name for what originally was called MPDV or multi-prospective domain validation. And there's been interesting progress there, and we want to go over what that is. So with that, why don't we start with shortening certificate lifespans? And again, at a high level, certificate lifespans are getting shorter. They just are. So if we can look at what's happened in the past, right? Once upon a time, in the world of public certificates, anything could be any length. There were no rules. And it was normative to create a root that expired in 20 or 30 years. It was normative to make other certs be whatever duration you wanted, and 10-year certs were not unheard of. And over time, that is shortened, and we'll get into the reason why. But you know, I think it's illuminating and interesting to look at what's happened at these 4 areas of certificates, right? SSL once upon a time was unlimited. Then when the BRs came in, it was knocked down to 3 years maximum term. And we've seen that over time go down to 2 years and then down to 1 year. Code signing was unlimited, and then when the code signing BRs came in, it got knocked down to 3 years. MIME was unlimited, and when the MIME BRs came in last year, it got knocked down to 3 years. And then trusted roots, as of the beginning of this year in 2024, in 2 of the major root programs are capped at 15 years in term. So all of these things are getting shorter. But I think what's maybe the important takeaway here, Nick, and the reason I put it this way, is that this isn't over, is it?
Absolutely not, Tim. No. I mean, you and I talk about this more than probably most people do, because a lot of people ask, and it's a very it's still a hot topic, I would say. But I think the interesting part to me on this slide is maybe everything below the first bullet, because we've talked a lot about SSL server certificates being reduced to 90 days, and the end goal is less. We keep saying that. It's not 90 days. I've spoken to people even recently, and they say, oh, well, I get to 90 days, then what happens? Well, we know the goal is to go shorter and shorter, but I think the interesting thing here is as a whole, as you said, yeah, all certificate lifetimes are shortening. And to me, one of the most interesting ones is that bottom item there, the roots, because they were historically kind of a fire and forget thing. You made them for 20, 30, 40 years, you got them included in a program, and that was it for that amount of time. But we're now starting to see policies that are going to get us as a CA have to cycle these certificates through much more rapidly than we have before, which is going to be something that may have an impact on people, and they should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, 7 years is just much shorter, right? 7 years is, you know, back when roots were 20 or 30 years in length, you kind of sort of figured like, oh, well, that's a lifetime from now. By the time this route expires, I'll probably be doing something entirely different, right? But 7 years, all of a sudden, people are like, well, you know what? By the time this expires, I'll probably be working at the same company, right? And in the same department. And so suddenly
True, and
yeah. Hmm?
I was going to say the reason this has started to happen though is that one of the major changes since when we were doing routes back in the early 2000s or the late 90s and embedding them for years is it's ultimately software updates.
Yeah.
Right. It's ultimately the fact that you don't have to wait till Microsoft released a service pack and update your Windows XP, and it happens once every couple of years. You know, everybody's phone, laptop, mobile device, everything is now updated on a much more regular basis. And if you look at people like Apple, they publish statistics even to say when we release iOS 201.16, 95% of people are updated within 3 months. And
Yeah,
so
much more
things like
reliably.
root certificates are much more reliable to update. Yeah, so we can get shorter, but it's interesting how that's much more different from what we were dealing with, 10, even not that many years ago.
Totally right. The days of saying, well, these are Windows XP systems, and there's this many Windows XP systems that are out in the world, and we need to be able to service them. Or there's this many versions of Android 4 out in the world, and we need to be able to service them. That's kind of gone away over time. Now there still are some tiny number of those systems in use in human beings' hands somewhere, but we're not going to make decisions based on supporting those. And as a result, once everybody's on kind of a modern software updated architecture, you do have the ability to do things like change routes much more than you did before. Yeah, so just rolling back up, I think that's a valid and important point, Nick. Rolling back up, SMIME right now is capped at 3 years, but in order to do that, the CA has to issue what is called a legacy profile certificate. We actually don't even support those at Sectigo, so we're already capped at 2 years. And the legacy profile is going to go away. And as the legacy profile goes away, I'm sure it'll be gone by the end of 2025. That'll maximize an SMIME at 2 years. There was a discussion at the last CAA browser forum, face-to-face, that the maximum term for code signing might go down to 15 months or perhaps even 12 months. So it's at 3 years right now. And then as we've discussed in the past, this concept of 10-day SSL certificates is around, right? There's actually, right now in the baseline requirements today, there is a provision that says that a public TLS cert that is not more than 10 days in term does not need to have revocation checking built into it at all. And that shows the direction that it's going, where the idea is if it's short enough in term, then you don't do revocation, you just replace it with a cert that
Let it
works.
expire.
Yeah, exactly. Expiration becomes your revocation. And if there's a rule, right, there's a rule right now in the CA browser forum where for certain kinds of misissuance, it's a 5-day revocation period. So that means you wouldn't have to revoke your cert for 5 anyway. So we're only going a little beyond that to get to 10. And at that point, the cert solves itself. And so that's not something that CA can pragmatically do today for reasons of root store requirements. But in terms of the cab form rules, they're in place. And eventually those root stores will probably, or that remaining root store will probably change its policy. And when that happens, then a CA will actually be able to issue 10-day certificates with no revocation checking at all. And the way is cleared for that. So, we see this trend in public cert. It is an inexorable trend. And the last point I'm going to make is when I see a 2-year SMIME, I don't think that's done. That's going to get shorter. It's just on its own timeline, right?
It is a little bit trickier with SMIME because the automation that's available on other cert types perhaps isn't fully there yet, but it's definitely a lot more mature than it was several years ago. And certainly, I agree with you, Tim. I don't think we're far off having much more rapidly evolving lifetimes for MIME as well. But I think the thing I was going to say that you touched on there, Tim, is these shorter lifetime certs and handling revocation by just letting it expire. It all speaks to the reason why this is happening, right? It's all to do with reducing risk and making things more secure by getting these lifetimes shorter.
Right.
Great segue into the next slide. Is that reduction of the risk window?
Right.
I tried to get the segue in.
Window, the first one, right? Why do we want certificate lifespans? Exactly. The risk is shorter. And clarify, like expand on that a little. In what ways is the risk window reduced?
Well, I think it's almost common sense, really, right? So shorter is better when it's something that's bad. If you have a certificate that is compromised in some way, let's say an attacker has a key and a certificate for a very big popular website, a big retailer, you know, something like a Gmail or a Facebook or a login page or a bank, God forbid, then the longer that is available for use, the worse things can happen, right? So if you have a 10-year certificate for that, that could arguably be up to 10 years of potential abuse for that certificate, or certainly a very long amount of time before we start to see browsers rolling out like hard-coded protections or doing something else that explicitly fixes that one problem. But if you've got lots of certificates, you can't practically do that. So the longer something is out there, the worse it is. It's that simple. If you can reduce that time of something being bad to as short as is feasibly possible, you have vastly reduced the risk for potentially billions of people. There are limits to this. As you know, we see on the previous slide, 10 days is what we kind of encourage that now. I have had people say, well, why don't we make it, 1 day? Why don't we make it less than a day? And while there are practical applications for very short term, or what we might call ephemeral certificates, in the public CA world, for all the kinds we've just talked about before, I would argue there's probably a lower bounds on that. Maybe there's somewhere between 7 to 10 days, but that's orders of magnitude less risk than a certificate that was perhaps valid for 15 years that we used to be able to sell not that long ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you get down to real short terms, you run into problems like clock syncing and things like that. But not in the time frames we're talking about, right? For the time frames we're talking about, they're fine. So that's a huge one, and just an interesting, I think an illustrative thought experiment on this is if I have put a certificate onto a server and I lose the private key because a bad guy gets into my system and I lose the private key 80 days into the lifespan of the certificate, then if it's a 90-day certificate, the bad guy has 10 days to exploit that. If it's a 398-day certificate, then the bad guy has more than 300 days to exploit that. And that's kind of a real easy way to see the example that you're talking about there. Now the second one is crypto agility, right? Which is and the real wake-up moment for this was the deprecation of SHA-1, right? Because SHA-1, it was determined that SHA-1 was not an okay hashing algorithm. We couldn't use it anymore. And so a deadline was set for CAs to deprecate it. And I don't remember the specific timing, but let's say that was a year later. And that meant that up until that day, they were still issuing certificates with SHA-1 in them. Now, at that point, 3-year certificates were allowed. So that means that 4 years after it was determined that this algorithm was not secure, legitimate certificates that were not misissued were still out there in the wild using this algorithm. And a lot of people, and especially people at browser root store programs, just said, this is not okay. This is not okay. We can't have this. And I think that was a real galvanizing force behind the reduction in certificate term that we've seen going on through today.
Absolutely. I mean, it's our ability to make changes when these kind of cryptographic primitives that we use have vulnerabilities or are generally thought to be unsafe. As SHA-1, SHA-2, it wasn't that it was completely broken overnight, but there were enough vulnerabilities with it to say it was unsafe to use. And that transition took a long time. You and I both lived through it, Tim, and we know how long it took. And the idea of having a shorter lifetime certificate means that if we do all decide that we need to change from one algorithm to another or one standard to another, we only have to wait the maximum amount of time of the longest certificate, which is not 15 years, it's not 10 years, it's not 5 years, 3 years.
Exactly.
It's down to maybe 1 year or hopefully a lot less. And as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later in this webinar today, one of the big reasons for this crypto agility is, of course, quantum computing and post-quantum encryption.
Absolutely.
There you
That's
go.
what all our algorithms are going to have to change. You got it, 100%.
Yeah.
And then
And that's one of the big drivers here, because we don't know when that's going to happen, right? It's a bit of an unknown at this point. And if everybody can be prepared in the time we have now, before we think, most people think it's practically feasible to have, a quantum computer that can break all the algorithms we use, then we're in a good state to be prepared for when it eventually does become a reality, and we're not all going, well, I can't change this for 15 years because it's embedded here and we don't want to change it, and just accept things that are broken. So it's lessons learned from the past, but it's also knowing what's happening in the future.
Absolutely agreed with all of the above. And all of this is enabled by automation. And automation, though it's come a long way in the last, let's say, 5 years, there still are vast and surprising gaps in automation of certificate management. So we've got, large, well-resourced enterprises that you would think would be best of breed in the area of IT services and uptime and security, that just have huge critical services that are not automated. And when certificates have to be swapped out, this stuff has to happen manually. And so if you go back to, if you ask why is this happening, the reason it's happening is because there isn't really a motivation for these enterprises to change, for these organizations to change. They've never had a problem, and they just don't prioritize it. It's very doable. It's 100% doable technically. They just don't prioritize it. And so as certificate lifespans come down over time, bit by bit by bit by bit, it will have a strong influence on those organizations and their priorities and their roadmaps.
I mean, I think automation is the big thing. You and I talk about an awful lot with this, Tim. It's the only way to really get to a state where you have shorter lifetime certs. But interestingly, one thing to note that happened recently is a lot of this 90-day talk came about from Google's announcement, around 12 months ago almost, where they announced this. But one of the things they mentioned in there, which only came into effect a few weeks ago, was that they are now requiring that any new CAs that are accepted into the Chrome, the Google Root program, have to have automation. They have to demonstrate support for ACME, for service certificate automation, in order to be able to be accepted. So it's one of these things that's absolutely necessary for short cert lifespans, but it's also something that's going to be required in the very near future, if not already.
And that's an interesting point. I think about this as encouraging automation in the users, the subscribers. But yeah, absolutely, the CAs need support it too, right? If the CAs don't support it, we're not anywhere. And then the last one is a marriage of domain control to certificates. So again, go down a little thought experiment with me. Let's say that you own a certain domain and you purchase a certificate for it, an SSL certificate, and you perform domain control validation, DCV, and you get a legitimately issued cert. Now, you go into a time where you have a DCV reuse period of 1 year, is what it is today. So I could then turn around and sell that domain, let's say, tomorrow to somebody else. And then 1 day before the expiration of my DV cert, I could go renew it and get a new cert instantly issued without having to perform DCV, according to the rules. Now, not all CAs do that, but according to the rules, you could do that. And then under those circumstances, I could literally have a certificate for 26 months, right? 13 months times 2, for a period of time, 26 months after I had given up control of the domain. And again, it would be a valid, compliant, non-misissued certificate. And once again, you get people at places like browser root programs and they say, gee, that's just too long. That's just too long. And so one of the things we've talked about with the reduction of SSL certs down to 90 days, which will come, is that the DCV, the reuse period, will also be reduced to 90 days. So now you add them together, the maximum that could occur would be 180 days, a little under half a year. and you start to say, okay, that's an awful lot better than over 2 years now, isn't it?
It's that reduction of another risk window, right? Like you said,
Yeah.
Tim, it's if we can get certificates down to 1 year from what they used to be, but because of the thing you've just explained in terms of how the domain verification works, we're actually arguably still at potentially a 2-year risk window in a lot of cases, which has been deemed unacceptable for a long time. So having these two things, these processes more tied together, more entwined, is definitely going to be safer for us. I thought it was a little bit of the kind of buried lead in the original Google announcement, because we know that doing these domain verification challenges is sometimes a challenge for people to be able to do. But again, it ties back to all the other items, especially encouraging automation, because there's absolutely automation that's been possible for a long time. And hopefully having to do that verification more often will force people to look at the automation options they have and take advantage of them with their domains and their DNS and their domain registrars and so on, and get the whole thing as automated as possible.
All right, so Nick, when you and I made this deck, we did a deep dive on each of these certificate types, but as is our habit, I think we kind of talked it to death on the top level.
Yeah.
So, we can hit the basics here, but we probably covered this. As you said, Chromium originally announced the 90-day intention in March. Apple discussed its support of this idea in October 2024 in the CAB forum face-to-face. And as we said, DCV will be limited to 90 days. There isn't a hard schedule. Once again, I view this as a sure thing in the long-term horizon. It's just a question of exactly how soon. Revocation is optional today, but the Microsoft Root Store program still has that requirement. We expect that to be removed in the future. Could be as early as this year, at which point 10-day non-revocation becomes practical. From the code signing perspective, I think we covered this. From the MIME perspective, I think we covered this.
Yep.
And then the trusted roots, I think we've already covered this as well. We are going to be having to deprecate our own AAA root.
Yep.
That's one of the things that's going to come. Even though the root isn't expired, the root's going to become pragmatically not usable.
Yeah, I think one of the points to mention on that one though, Tim, is sorry, just because with our route, and there's a few others as well from various CAs who've got routes that are fairly long standing, and the route programs, kind of want to get them phased out, deprecated. It's not that it's kind of going to go away and be completely unusable. One of the advantages and one of the reasons we certainly use that AAA route, which is our old legacy one, it's not what we use to sign certificates today. It's an old one, and we use something called cross-signing, which is a fairly complex topic that we don't want to get into now. But what it allows us to do is to still use that certificate in such a way that it means the certificates we issue are great for backward compatibility on really old devices that perhaps haven't been updated in a while, the devices that arguably need to be updated but haven't been for various reasons. The certificate will still work there. And I think other CAs, there's other routes out there that are in a similar position. They're using these older routes as kind of backward compatibility. So it's just to say that while they will no longer be supported in modern platforms, they'll be removed from new versions of Firefox, for example, and perhaps new versions of iOS and Mac OS and the rest, they will still be functional in terms of the backward compatibility for older devices which haven't updated anyway. I just don't want anybody to panic and think
that's
that
fair.
It's more that they will be only used for backward compatibility, which is a sensible thing. We support that. We don't want to have legacy stuff in active use, but we do want to support people on, older or non-updatable devices where possible.
And as it happens, if we're talking about devices where updates don't occur, then any change that Chrome or Apple makes to their root program today won't touch those devices anyway.
Exactly,
So
and those devices as well have a natural kind of lifetime too. We also saw there were a lot of legacy devices that weren't able to support SHA-2, and they just naturally fell out of support from any CA, not just from Sectigo or anybody else, because they simply weren't able to support what modern certificates were now having to be created at. So there's always a natural cliff with a lot of these older devices, but in many cases they need to be supported for as long as they can be, without going too far the opposite way with security practices.
Fair enough. Okay, so moving on to CAA for MIME. So CAA stands for CA authorization. And what this
Certificate
is,
authority authorization. Yeah.
yes, correct. So if you say certificate authority authorization, it sounds a little redundant, doesn't it? But that's what it's called. And what it does is it allows the controller of DNS for a domain to put in a correctly coded DNS entry that will then create an allow list of CAs that can issue certs for that domain. And all public CAs are expected to check and follow this allow list. So if somebody, just hypothetically, because we're Sectigo, if somebody decided to create a CAA record and the only thing they were going to have in there was Sectigo, then Sectigo would be the only CA that was allowed to actually issue certs on this domain. And this is there to give you some control. It's basically to help central management, the CIO's office, for want of a better word, to get some kind of a handle on rogue certificates. So you decide we're going to allow certificates from these CAs and none other, and then you put your CAA record in, and it prevents somebody from going out to any of the 100 public CAs they might choose somewhere in the globe and issue a certificate when you do not feel that you have a trust relationship with that public CA. This has been a requirement for TLS since 2017. We follow it. All CAs follow it. I'm sure they have to. And it is on the way. It is in process in the SMIME working group inside the CA Browser Forum to build this as a requirement for SMIME as well. And we expect that early in 2025, there will be a separate parallel available CAA record in DNS where you can use to make your own independent decisions about which CAs will be allowed to issue SMIME certificates on that domain. Now, how it works with CAA is if there is no record at all, then all CAs are allowed. But as soon as a record is created that's correctly formatted, then it becomes an allow list, and only the CAs, that are on the list are allowed. You were going to say, Nick?
I was just going to say, it should also be noted that there is a little bit of granularity in CAA that I think you touched on. For server certificates, you can say issue not like single certificates or issue wildcards. Obviously, SMIME is going to be extension to that, and there's even some new extensions in the works where you can designate specific account identifiers in CAA, right? So again, it's about that control you mentioned, Tim, but it means that you could also say, hey, we only want Sectigo to be able to issue certificates for our domain, but we explicitly only want Sectigo to use certificates from this particular account. And it's like a free-form account identifier, but it allows us to make sure that if we're issuing for customer A and they have like an enterprise account with us, we only use that to issue certificates. And if one of their employees decides to go and buy something from our retail website, that is blocked in favor of the actual main account that person has with us. So it's all about giving control back to the domain owner for whom the certificates are ultimately being issued.
Yeah, and again, let's emphasize this is optional. You can decide you don't want to do this and make sure that your DNS is clear of CAA records, and you don't have to make these kind of decisions and have these overheads, and you can let your organization do what it does. So this isn't about preventing an organization from operating, broadly if that's what makes sense for it, but it is about making sure that potential control is available. That will come available next year. I'm sure we will tell you about it when it comes, and it'll be a thing you can avail yourself of if you would like to and if it makes sense. Post-quantum cryptography. Let's give an update on post-quantum cryptography just because it's kind of been a while. And the first thing to know is that the winning algorithms have been renamed, and I realized I couldn't figure out. I didn't put in the name for FNDSA because I couldn't find it. So shame on me. But what used to be Crystals Kyber is MLChem. What used to be Crystals Dilithium is MLDSA. What used to be Sphinx is SLHDSA. And what used to be Falcon is FNDSA, and I don't know what FN stands for. So shame on me. But these are now official names. So you're going to start seeing these names. They're going to be floating around. We've been running around saying Kyber and dilithium. I don't know how well those names are going to stick, but you're going to start to see MLChem, MLDSA, SLHDSA. And I've got here what they stand for, right? And they all make sense if you think about it. Module lattice-based key encapsulation mechanism. Okay, that's what it is. Module lattice-based digital signature algorithm. Stateless hash-based digital signature algorithm, and mystery. And so, those are going to be words. And when you start to see those words, you might say, what the heck are these words? That's what these words are. And the MLKM and MLDSA are going to be the most used, I think, by a lot. So those are the ones you're normally going to see and hear about and talk about.
Yep. Well, yeah, we're going to get used to seeing all these, aren't we? Because of the wonderful advances in post-quantum. We had a lot of people asking about what's happening with this and where are things going to go with it. And I think it is. I agree with you, Tim. Sometimes the name might not stick, and we might not always remember them. But it's certainly important to know, given that we've been used to just RSA and ECC for the longest time. We've got a bunch of new names to get used to. I have just very quickly Googled the Falcon thing as well. FN apparently stands for FFT over NTRU lattices. So another mouthful of acronyms there as well.
Sorry about that. I was looking it up and I got distracted and I forgot to go finish the job. So what happens with these algorithms now? So standards are being worked on for these primitives. So the primitives are just math. They're just math, right? And so what happens now is the math needs to be encapsulated into interoperable standards that are worked on so that we can all make software that will work with it and work with it consistently and predictably and correctly. As these come out of IETF, then root programs, CA Browser Forum, and Etsy are going to have to update their requirements to do it. I expect that to be pretty fast because all these organizations are tracking what's going on. And it's not going to be a surprise. We're not going to wake up and say, oh, wow, look, there's some standards. Let's figure out what they are. They're watching them every step of the way. And then as those three organizations, root programs, CA Browser Forum, and Etsy, have their requirements solidified, that makes it possible at that point for public CAs and private PKI services to use these for commercial products. And I expect those commercial products to come very imminently after the rules are solidified and CAs are allowed to do that. For the same reason, they're tracking it. They're tracking it in real time. They know what's coming. Nobody's going to be surprised by this. There's not going to be a surprise ballot we're not expecting. However, those certs aren't really going to be of any value if your software and hardware products don't support them. So again, simultaneously with this, technology vendors need to be doing their work so they can use these primitives and they can use hybrid certificates, which is another thing that's coming as part of this. And then at that point, your organization can start deploying. And don't expect all these things to come at the same time. So you'll probably get some vendors release their PQC compatible software before other vendors do. And part of your deployment project is going to be to understanding when can I deploy this and it will actually work. And you may have mismatches on timelines on those things, which is part of what hybrid certificates are about. You could put hybrid certificates in and they'll use new algorithms with the new people, old algorithms with the old people, and then you gradually swap it out to all new algorithms over time. So this is what's coming. This is the next set of steps.
And I think to me, Tim, this illustrates one of the questions that I had asked quite a lot. Is, can I have certificates? Can I have post-quantum certificate today? Can you issue me a post-quantum cert today?
Yep.
And I think this illustrates that there's a list of things that need to be done first before we can get to that stage, right? We would love to. We can probably technically issue some today if we really wanted to, but the guidelines say we're basically not allowed to. The hardware isn't quite there yet for us. The software that we use as a CA isn't quite there yet. And even if we did manage to produce one, despite all that, it's not anything misissued and we'd have to for you and your infrastructure.
Right.
There is that as well.
You would have to revoke it. And also, it wouldn't work with any of your stuff.
That's the key thing. It just wouldn't work. There's a whole list of reasons as to why we wouldn't do it today. But as you said, once these little bricks start to fall into place, it'll advance very quickly. So we should hopefully go from, standards being properly updated and software and stuff being updated to being able to issue certificates in fairly short order. I think the longer tail of this will be kind of what we touched on before, how long it takes software to roll out. So again, if a version of Windows is updated to support these with the latest version of Edge and the rest of the operating system, that's still going to take a fair amount of time to roll out to a big enough population that you can use these certificates, let's say, on your website. That might not be something you can do practically for maybe even a few years yet, but there's technology there that you can do these hybrid things, or you can have it serve one type of certificate to one browser and another type to the other. So there are options, but it's just really to say that there's a few more steps that have to happen before we can issue post-quantum certificates today.
Right. And then what happens with all of those legacy environments that you have where something hasn't been updated in 15 years and it's running on Oracle 8 and, it'll never work with this until it gets updated and nobody wants to touch it because of the risk. And you have to deal with all that stuff too, right?
Exactly.
Meanwhile, though, there is what NIST called round 4, and round 4 does continue. So there are 3 algorithms here. They're called Classic Macaulay and HQC. And the main thing about these algorithms is they're not based on the lattice-based techniques. So if we look back to these algorithm names, module lattice-based key encapsulation mechanism, module lattice-based digital signature algorithm. So lattice-based, we have a lot of eggs in the lattice basket, which is a certain kind of mathematical problem that underlines these algorithms. And the problem with that is, what if some genius somewhere comes up with an entirely new way to think about breaking a lattice-based math problem that nobody's ever thought of? And NIST is uncomfortable with having all of their eggs in that basket. So there continues to be work on these 3 non-lattice-based algorithms. There were 4, but one of them was completely defeated. No specific timeline on this. And at the same time, NIST has created what they call the onramp. They announced this last year. And the onramp is an additional set of digital signature candidates. These are no key encapsulation methods. Those are handles, mechanism. I never get that word right. No key encapsulation mechanisms. Those are considered to be handled, but they're looking for more digital signatures. And they've got 40 total candidates, and they're open-minded to better approaches to lattice. But what NIST is really looking for the most part, is non-lattice-based approaches. So once again, a different fundamental mathematical problem that is fundamentally different to diversify our risk and not have all of our eggs in that basket. And you can see here, they've got a broad variety of things that they're looking at that are all over the place. And so with the on-ramp and with round 4, there is no specific timeline. It's more a recognition that, look, we got a set of things we can use today that solve the known problems today and the quantum computer problem today. But the thing about the march of technology and the progress of human knowledge is that you don't know what it's going to be in the future, or you'd already know it. And therefore, we need to have, this is NIST's opinion, we need to have a broad set of cryptographic alternatives for the world to use. And so they're going to keep pushing this possibly forever. This might just be the new normal. And it's something that we'll keep tracking and keeping an eye on. And it may be that some of these algorithms later on become things that are in our toolkit. For now, let's think about MLChem, MLDSA, and then these other 2 once in a while as the next generation in cryptography. And let's talk about,
and I think that does speak, Tim, very, very quickly, it does speak to that cryptography, the crypto agility that you mentioned before, right? I mean, they do introduce some new standards, and we need to be able to manipulate and change very quickly. We're all automated, we're all agile, and we're all ready to go. Because one of the things I think that was interesting for me is that even in that round 4, they've already lost one candidate, and certainly other rounds, there were already candidates that were lost, not for any reason that they didn't go, oh, this is potentially unfeasible, this doesn't work. There were some eliminations, I'm sure, on the basis of things like how difficult it was to work, but there were some eliminations because they were broken.
Yeah.
Researchers looked at these candidates.
Yeah.
Exactly, and they went, it's just broken. And now imagine that process hadn't taken place, or imagine it hadn't happened well enough or been scrutinized well enough. We'd all be trying to deploy this new algorithm that then X months in could be broken. And if we look at ECC and RSA as we use them today, yes, we know they have problems in the future. We know there are certain sharp edges we have to be careful of. But by and large, they've lasted a good deal of time under a good deal of scrutiny. And what we don't want to do is move so quickly to something that then ends up being broken very, very rapidly, especially if people aren't prepared for the kind of agility they need to be. So it's kind of all illustrates the same point for us, I think, Tim.
Yeah, and one of the things about classic MAC-Elise, not to get too far down in the weeds, is part of the main reason that classic MAC-Elise is still around is because this basic approach is very old and it has been studied a lot, and there's a high degree of confidence that it is cryptographically secure. And so part of the idea here is let's have something where we have that high degree of confidence that is cryptographically secure, something that's been around and has been beaten up for a long time for that exactly that reason. All right, so MPIC or MPIC is short for multi-perspective issuance corroboration. And this is the official name for what you and I were originally calling MPDV, or multi-perspective domain validation. And the reason for that domain change is because it turns out that MPIC influences more than just DCV. It influences anything where a CA needs to look at a specific domain name. And as a reminder, what's the capsule summary of why we need MPIC at all, Nick?
So basically, it's due to do with the vulnerability of the underlying protocols that the internet uses, unfortunately. Yeah. So there is something called BGP, or Border Gateway Protocol, which basically determines how all the routers of the big transit providers and networks kind of talk to each other. And it is possible in some cases, many cases, to kind of subvert that. And it's happened in a bunch of different attacks. There's been attacks on financial things and crypto exchanges. And I think even a few years ago, YouTube was kind of attacked in this way. But it's possible for an attacker to basically say, hey, I control these IP addresses, send the information for them to me. And ultimately what that means is that the domain verification process that we have to go through as a CA can be subverted. What we have to do is if someone says, I want a certificate for nickfrance.com, we have to be able to prove they have control of that domain. And hopefully everybody knows the different ways we do that. We can send an email there, or we can do a DNS lookup, or we can do a HTTP request or something. But if those requests can be subverted, then we're potentially issuing certificates for a domain to someone who isn't actually in control of that domain. And so the idea is, if we can check this domain verification or any of these DNS features from multiple perspectives, and perspectives being a different network. These attacks are only really effective against a specific target on a specific network you know about. So if I check this DNS record from one place, and the attacker knows that, I could be vulnerable. If I can check it from, my home here, I can check it with my cellular provider, I could check it with a server at Google Cloud and Amazon and Microsoft Azure, then I've had all these perspectives, and if they all agree, then I know I'm getting the right answer.
It would be a hell of a BGP attack to fool all of those things, right? I mean, that would be the mother of all BGP attacks, right? Not something that is deemed to be technically practical today.
Yep, exactly. It's about getting that quorum from multiple perspectives, and I this is probably a terrible analogy, but I'll use it anyway. It reminds me of the film Minority Report. With the psychics that can see stuff in the future. All three of them were supposed to agree in order that became a real prediction, and it's the same kind of thing. You've got to check it from multiple perspectives. If they all agree, great. If there's dissent, if there's not a quorum, you potentially have a problem, and you're not supposed to issue the certificate. And in theory, investigate that, I guess. But it's really just about getting that quorum to avoid these network-based attacks.
Yeah, And so the things that we know are going to be affected and require this potentially of BGP attack are CAA, which we already defined earlier on this call, right? Because if you go look at a DNS record, it's got to be the real DNS record. DNS-based DCV and HTML-based DCV. And these are all places where subverting the actual DNS behavior could directly lead to some kind of misissuance or other attack against the CA. So yeah, you talked about these remote network perspectives. So there were some questions. So this was a well understood idea, but there was not a lot of clarity on what is this going to mean in terms of brass tacks. And what happened is there is now a ballot in the CA browser forum for discussion, in a discussion period. And so this ballot defines some of these things that previously were undefined. And so this is a great thing for us to look at. And it is a ballot in the discussion period. It might not make it. It might be withdrawn if there's considerable criticism, or it might fail as a ballot. But imagine that something's going to pass that is going to look an awful lot like this, even if it's not exactly the same. And I think that's a very safe prediction. And the first one is there's a definition of a remote network perspective, which is that whenever the traffic leaves whatever encrypted tunnel that the CA is using and goes into what we sometimes call the DMZ, at that point, these perspectives must all be 500 kilometers away from the others. And I found it interesting that the measure is physical, right? Because it's not really about physical, it's about network logic. But it seems to me that this is probably the most reliable way to actually measure that. That mapping network logic might be hard, but if I enforce a certain amount of physical distance, then by its nature, that network logical, that separation of logic, of network logic will occur on its own.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that, Tim. It's about making sure that when this is implemented, it's not just someone trying to kind of do the bare minimum and okay, I'll stick 2 servers in the exact same data center in the same rack with the same internet transit providers, just one at one rack, or one in rack 1 and one in rack 10. You know, it's kind of to try and avoid that. It's to try, and I think you're right as well that trying to express how to guarantee kind of different network of access and topology is kind of difficult, whereas a physical definition that everybody knows and understands probably gets
it's subjective. You can say it is or it isn't, right? And then there's this concept of quorum agreements. So depending on the number of points that they use, the quorum agreement basically is the idea if you're using 2 to 5 points, all but 1 must agree. And if you're using 6 or more points, all but 2 must agree. And by the way, they could all agree. It could be they all agree, that would be fine. But if you don't do that, you don't have quorum agreement. And if you don't have quorum agreement, then you cannot, then DCV is not achieved and the certificate cannot be issued.
Exactly.
Now, there's a fade in over time. So this is how it works, right? So the first column is the date. The second column is that the CA must use multiple perspectives. Third column is the number of perspectives it must use. And then the fourth column is whether or not corroboration is required. And so you can see what happens is it fades in. So on September 15, 2024 of this year, there is a should requirement, which means that a CA is not non-compliant if it doesn't do it. But there is strong guidance to the CAs that they should be using 2 or more perspectives at that time. And at that time, there's no requirement for the CA to actually use corroboration to issue. Then on March 15 of 2025, next year, the should requirement turns into a must requirement. The CA must use at least 2 perspectives. And if they don't, if they perform DCV without doing that, that is a non-compliant issuance. However, corroboration is still not required. It doesn't matter if they match. What matters is that the 2 perspectives are used, that technically the CA is using the perspectives and they're doing it correctly. Then on September 15, 2025, It's still a must use, it's still 2 perspectives, but now corroboration is required. Now again, if we go back to a quorum for 2 to 5 points, it's all but 1. So this is still kind of a pretty lightweight requirement. What it's saying here is that at least one of them must match what you expect. Doesn't seem all that exciting, but this is because it's a phase in. And as you watch, at this point, the phase in comes faster and faster, right? Now it's March 15, and then June 15, and then September 15. So every 3 months, corroboration is required, and the number of minimum points goes up, 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. So by the end of 2026, by Q4 of 2026, we are getting 5 perspectives, and if 4 or more of them do not match, the certificate may not be issued. Now, CAs can have more than that, right? So if I wanted to have 12 perspectives, that would be fine, at which point 10 of them would have to match, right? Because it would be 6+ points. But this is the phase in, and this is the time when it's going to come. Now, what does it matter to you as a subscriber? This part shouldn't really matter. This is work for the CA to do, but it's a pretty important change in how DCV is done. It may have effects that people see, and it's good to know about how this industry works. So that's why we talked about it today.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Tim. It's one of these CA problems, really. It's one of the things we have to do. I think it does bear mentioning for a few people I've seen over the years, especially enterprises, where they've said, hey, if you're doing these DCV checks on our domains or our websites, more specifically if they're using the HTTP checks, can you tell us where you make these checks from and give us the IP addresses so we can list them through our systems? That's something that will cause a problem. If you're one of those organizations that does that kind of thing today and you only allow your CA to do checks from certain IP addresses, this will cause you problems because it will be multiple and potentially random IP addresses and connections that are being made to your system.
Yeah.
That's really the only edge case where I can see customers having problems. Hopefully there won't be too many of those, and hopefully I think CAs with this timeline have a little bit of time.
There's a phase-in period, so hopefully those things can get caught and shaken out before they're preventing people from issuing certs.
Yeah, I was going to say, hopefully the CAs, I know we probably intend to as well, to do some kind of logging at first and see whether it kind of fails or not and notify people who have problems. But it's very much a CA problem, but just something to be really aware of for the future.
So shameless pitch time. If you liked this conversation, I do co-host a podcast called Root Causes, the PKI Security Podcast, with an association of Nixon Mind, Jason Sirocco. We put new episodes up every week. We talk about all kinds of things involving encryption, digital certificates, domain validation, PKI, digital identity, etc. All the topics that you see here today have been covered in some form in this podcast and much, much more. So please, please, please come join me. Just search on Root Causes Podcast. It'll be trivially easy to find. It's all the places you listen to podcasts. And with that, we're ready for questions. Do we have any questions?
We have got a few, yes.
Okay.
First question, is there a push from the CA and browser industry to get vendors to standardize certificate implementations to make everything more agile? If our software and hardware can't be automated, how can we quickly change to new standards and algorithms?
So the tool, Nick, you can chime in on this if you want. The tool that's really available to browsers is this shortening certificate lifespan, right? That's the stick they have. If they force CAs to shorten the lifespan of public certs, and if vendors, if subscribers require public certs, then subscribers require vendors to support that, and that puts pressure on the vendor's roadmap. You as a subscriber, as somebody who purchases security software or IT management software, also have power. You can contact your own vendors and say, this is important to us. And a bunch of enterprises calling up and saying, this is something I really want, will move the needle on a roadmap. It really will. And so that is a power that the subscribers here have. We as CAs are big on education and communicating and trying to explain why it's important and trying to explain that it's inevitable and it's coming and this is why, and this is the kind of talk you saw here today, part of why we're doing it. Do we have this conversation with software and hardware providers? Yes, we do. We tell them too. And encourage them to make the right decisions on their roadmaps and make the right decisions for their customers.
Yep. No, I think you're right, Tim. I don't have much to add. The only other thing I would say is open standards are another advantage here and another thing. So you've obviously got ACME now, which is the obvious choice. It's an open, well-defined standard. It's something that vendors, hardware and software vendors, can take and to integrate in their products freely. There's thousands of client and server implementations and software libraries and things. So having that, which is something we perhaps didn't have 10 years ago, or we just about had 10 years ago, is something that I think is going to encourage these the vendors to do something. But I'd certainly say, as a customer, as a subscriber, you also do need to help and speak to the speak to your vendors as well and push them to support things like ACME and better support for certificate automation.
Great. Then we had a similar question a few times. Could the 90-day cert change happen before the end of this year, or can you provide a timeline?
No way. So the timeline is unknown. No way it'll happen before the end of this year. So if you look at historic changes, when changes of this magnitude are made, usually we all get about a year to adjust. It was about a year to get ready for SMIME BRs. It was about a year to get ready for attaching for all code signing certs to be delivered on physical keys. It was about a year for reduction from 3 years to 2 years for public SSL, about a year for reduction from 2 years to 1. So that's a real good guess. It would be surprising to see anybody do anything faster than that. So we're already into 2024. So I don't see this occurring prior to 2025. I think that it occurring by the end of 2025 is likely. Just because there's been a lot of noise and motion and attention on this, I do consider that likely. And so if you say, gee, I need to get my organization ready for 90-year certificates, that could take a year. It's real easy to imagine that taking a year. And so if that's the case, you might want to get started on figuring out what does getting ready look like. Because if something does come down sometime this year and you got a year to get ready, you're going to be happy if you got started.
I mean, I've heard a lot of people ask the same question and ask about dates and timelines. And Tim, you and I have speculated before, and I completely agree with what you just said in terms of the timelines. It's not something we control, and it's not something that's been publicly announced. But I think what I've always said, as I'm sure you have, is the time to prepare is now. Google have been very clear this is going to happen. We've also seen precedent for other trust programs, such as Apple, to make these announcements, almost unannounced. They'll say they may turn around and say, "Hey, we want this 90-day thing on this date." So it's not that we don't know the exact date yet. We just know that it is coming, and I think your timelines are reasonable. But as you said, Tim, this is something that can take people a lot of time to implement. Some people can do it very quickly. Some organizations take a lot longer. The time to start is now. There's no downside to doing this. I appreciate, with a lot of enterprises, it's about getting resources and budget and things and having a reason to do these sorts of things. But I would say this is something we know is going to happen. It's something that is a benefit for all of us when we get there. So there's no reason not to start your implementation of this now. The technology from the CA side is there. The technology for automation is there. It just needs, you as a subscriber, as a customer, to make that push and implement it in your organization.
Great. I think we've got time to squeeze one more question.
Okay.
Is there a timeline for the deprecation of the Sectigo AAA route?
So as I said before, in terms of specific deprecation from our side, we're not planning to kind of stop using it tomorrow or anything. It will be removed from at least the Mozilla root program in, I believe it's around about 12 months from now, is it, Tim? Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. We could double check, and we will be doing some communication, but we only provide it today as part of a bundle with our cross certificates, right? So it's again, without going into too much of the technical details right now, it's something called a cross certificate. So we provide it with any certificate you request from us. A cross signature back to the AAA is provided in order to provide that backward compatibility. It is not required to be installed. It does not have to be used by any of our customers. Indeed, a majority of them don't actively install it or use it today. It will work when you have an old legacy device, and it will continue to work if you have an old legacy device, after the deadline until that root certificate expires in a few more years' time. But we aren't actively using it today. So while it will not be trusted in the Mozilla program at least, and potentially others sometime early next year, it will still function for the purpose that it does today, which is support that backward compatibility. And we'll definitely do some communication to any customers that we know, or we already have, to customers that we know are having dedicated CAs from that. We've already started and completed much of that work. And we'll have knowledge base articles ready for anybody that does have more questions or concerns, but it's not something that's going to impact the overwhelming majority of customers, because it's simply there to provide that legacy compatibility and is optional.
Great. We are literally bang on time for clock, so I think we'll stop here. We'll answer any remaining questions directly with you. There isn't many. Thank you everyone for your time, and thanks Nick and Tim. If you've got any more questions, do get in touch with the Sectigo team. In April, we've got a new webinar coming for you. It's an introduction to private PKI, and you can sign up on our website. We'd love to see you there. And for now, thank you and have a good rest of your day.